Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over user sign-in and user registration in React Native, and on the back end we're going to be using Golang and PostgreSQL to store the user information. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned for the rest of the video and let's get started in building this thing out. So before we get started coding our server, make sure that you have Postgres installed. I'll leave a link to this documentation in the description. Also, make sure that you have Golang installed, and I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get started in coding our server. Here I am in our main file, and let's create a new folder called models. And it's here that we'll actually create our user model. So just make a file called user.go. And then we'll say package is models. So now we'll need to install a package called Gorm. And pretty much Gorm just allows us to abstract our SQL statements. So let's copy this down, go get gorm.io/gorm. And then let's go back to our terminal and paste it in and run it. Okay. So now import gorm.io/gorm. And below this, let's create a new struct. So to do that, you say type user, and then you say struct, and then you create some brackets here. And a user is going to have a couple different fields. So the first thing that we're going to put in this user model is gorm.model, and that's the equivalent of saying ID, updated at, deleted at, and created at. But it's a lot nicer just having one line instead of four. So that's why we're putting it there. Our next field is going to be called first name, and make sure to capitalize it, and it's going to be a string. And then to specify how it looks in JSON format, we are going to add some backticks and say JSON, add some colons, and then we'll say first name and camel case. And then let's just copy this and paste it here and do the same for last name. Say last name, and let's make this lowercase there. Next we want to do email. And then we want password, which will also be a string. JSON be password. And then we'd like to know if this user was created via a social media login. So we'll say social login. And that will be a Boolean. And we'll do the same thing here, just saying social login. And underneath that, we can specify whether it's Apple, Google, or Facebook. So our next field will be social provider. And this will be a string. And we'll do the same thing here, say social provider. Alright, so our user model is created, and pretty much this will act as a table in our database. So now we need to connect to our database and add this in as a table. And to do that, let's add a new folder, and we're going to call it storage. And within this folder, create a new file called database.go. Now the package is going to be storage. Now let's import our user model. So go import apartments-clone-server and then /models. And then from here we can get our user model. And here let's create a variable called db. It will be a pointer of type gorm.db. So that auto imported. And now let's go and create a PostgreSQL database. I'm going to use the GUI for this, but feel free to use the terminal if you want. So here I'm going to create a new server group. And we'll call it apartments. and save. Now within this server group, let's register a new server. The name will be apartment server. Let's look at the connection here. The host name will just be localhost. The port will be 5432, maintenance database. Let's change the maintenance database from Postgres to apartments clone. And I'm going to create a new username here named apartments admin. And I'll create a new password with that as well. I'll save the password here. The role, we'll just say admin. Service, I don't think we need to save anything there. And this all looks good here. So we'll save that. Internal failed to set up role. Okay. So get rid of role there. And let's save that. So now apartment server exists and we have a few different things. So here in the apartment server, let's create a new database. And let's call it apartments server DB. And then save that. So in our .env file, let's create a new variable called db connection string. And we need to fill out a couple different variables within this. So those are going to be host, user, password, db name, port, and SSL mode. So in order to get these variables, we just created our db, so we know the db name and the port. But in case you forgot, you can go back to your Postgres GUI and then come back to your instance here, click on properties and click connection, and then here you'll have your host name, so we can just say localhost, pass that in, your port, and the port's always easy because it's counting backwards, 5432. So that's nice. For SSL mode, I wonder if they will specify here. Okay. For SSL mode, we will say disable. For the DB name, we said apartments server DB. Apartments server DB. And then for the user here, we said apartments admin. And then just put in your password here. All right, so now let's create a new function called connect to DB, and it's going to return a gormdb pointer. And in the first line, we will load our environment variables. So we'll be using a package go.env and be calling the load method there, or the load function rather. And then let's import that. And if we get an error, we need to handle that. So we'll say if the error is not equal to nil, we'll panic and specify that there was an error loading the .env file. And then from there, we will get our db connection string. So we need to import OS here and then get the environment variable, which is that db connection string. And we're going to assign it to this variable dsn. And then we need to connect to our database here. So we'll create two variables here because the open function will return both a db pointer and an error. So our first one should be a db pointer, and then if there's an error, db error will get that. So we'll say gorm.open, postgres.open, and then pass in that connection string. And then for the second argument, we'll pass in gorm.config. And here we need to import Postgres. And if you don't have this installed, there should be a pop-up here with a quick fix, and that usually solves the problem for me. Otherwise, you would just do go get gorm.io/driver/Postgres. So here, if we get an error, we need to handle that. And right now, we'll just log it in our logs to say that there was an error connecting to our database. And then we'll assign DB here to this, and then return database. Now, underneath of this, we'll create a function called perform migrations, and it will take in a database pointer, and we'll just say db.automigrate, and we'll pass in our users model. And in the future, we'll be passing in any model that we create. Now let's create a function to initialize our database, and it will also return a database pointer. So our first line here, we will call our connect_to_db function. So we'll say db is equal to connect_to_db. And then we will perform our migrations on our database, and then return db. Now let's go back to main.go, and let's import our storage package. So say apartments -clone -server /storage. And then here underneath loading our environment variables, we'll say storage.initializeDB. And now let's run it. So we'll say go run main.go. And here you can see the SQL. It's creating a table users, and these are the fields. So let's just go and query that real quickly in the database. So I'll go to apartment server DB here. We will actually refresh because it's not going to show the tables right now. So refresh here. And then in our schemas, we'll go to tables. And there's users. And then let's just go to the query tool. And then we'll just say select everything from users. And let's run that, pressing F5. And here we can just see our schema that we just created. So everything is working as intended. All right, so with storage created, we now need to create our functions to register and log in a user. So let's go to our routes folder, and we'll create a new file called user.go. It's part of the package routes or roots. And then we'll create a function here called register. And it's going to be taking in an iris context. And it won't be returning anything. So let's import iris here. Now down below, let's create the data structure for what the register input should look like. So we'll create a new struct here called register user input. It will have a field of first name, which will be a string, and in JSON it should look like this, where it's camel case first name. And then we'll have a validate field here, and we'll set that to required with a max of 256. Now beneath that, it will be last name, and everything's really the same. Beneath that, it will be email. The JSON will read email. For validate, it's going to be required. It's going to have a max of 256, and at the end here, we're going to say that it needs to be an email. For password, we're going to have that also be a string. The JSON will say that it's a password. The validate is that it's required. It's going to have a min of 8 and a max of 256. So with that done, let's create a variable in our register function, which should look like this. So we'll say var user input is a register user input, and then we will read the JSON from that, and if there's an error, we need to handle that. And for right now, we're just going to log that to the console. So fmt print line error.error, and then we'll return. Otherwise, we'd like to create a new user model here. So let's import the models package. And then let's create a function to see if the user already exists. And I'm going to call that get and handle user exists. it's going to be taking in a user pointer or a user model pointer and an email, and it will return a Boolean and an error. Now within this, we need to query our database. So let's import storage here and also import string or strings. And we'll create this variable called userExistQuery and then query the database where email is equal to the passed in email. And we just need to limit that to the first one and find the user. Now if there's an error getting that query, or userExistQuery.error is not equal to nil, then we need to return false, and then we'll just return that error. And then we'll create a variable here called userExists, and it's going to be equal to userExistQueries.rowsAffected. And if that's going to be greater than 0, then the user does exist. So if userExists equals to true, then we return true and nil. Otherwise, we return false and nil. Now back in our register function, we'll create two new variables and call get and handle userExists. So those are going to be userExists and userExistError, and then just pass in the user and the user input.email. And if we have a userExistError, let's just log it to the console again. Now if the user exists, we need to tell that to the user, but for right now we're just going to log it to the console that the user already exists. So fmt.println user exists, and then just return. Now if we get to this point, the user does not exist, so we'd like to hash insult their password and then store that information in our database. So let's create a new function down below, and we're going to call it hash insult password. It's going to take in a password, which is a string, and return both a hash password and an error here. And we're going to create two new variables here, bytes and error, and it's going to be equal to bcrypt.generate from password. We're going to pass in our password and switch that to a byte type or byte type array. And then for the second argument here, we will say bcrypt.defaultCost, which will be 10. And let's add the import of bcrypt. Now if error is not equal to nil, we'd like to return an empty string and the error. Otherwise, return a string of the bytes and nil. Now let's create two new variables, hash password and hash error. And we'll pass in the user input.password into that function we just created, hash insult password. And then we'll just copy this and say if hash error is not equal to nil, then we need to print hash error.error. And we're going to change all this stuff later, but this is just to get the ball rolling. Now we'll take new user here and create a new user. So we'll pass in user input.firstname for first name. Same thing with last name, except with the last name property here. And then for the email, we'll say strings.toLower user input.email. The password will be the hashed password, and for social login, it will be false. And then beneath that, we'll say storage.db.create, passing in this new user. Now underneath of this, we'll say context.json, passing in an iris map, and then we'll have ID here, which will be assigned the new user.id, first name, which will be new user.firstname, last name, which will be the last name, and then email, which will be the new user.email. So with the register created, let's go back to main.go and create a new endpoint. And we'll call this user and assign it to app.party API, and we'll put a slash there, and then user, and then we'll say user.post /register, And then we'll say routes dot register. And with that done, let's open up the terminal and run main.go. So let's open up a new request, change this to post. We'll say HTTP localhost port 4000 /API /user /register. We'll go to body here, raw JSON, and then we'll say first name will be J, last name will be P, our email is going to be j@p.com, and our password will be password 123. Alright, now let's test it out. So that was valid, a valid user input, and let's actually go and check out what's available for the users here. So we'll run F5, wait. So here, as you can see, we have a new user in our database, and let's change this slightly so that it's jp1 or j@p1.com. Everything's the same, and then we'll run this again, F5. And the cool thing is, even though it's the same password in our database, it doesn't get stored that way. So that's always good for security purposes. But now let's try it with the same email. So we already registered this email, so let's click send here. And we got nothing because we aren't returning anything right now. But in our console here, we should have something. Oh, user exists here. So that's good. The only thing that we now need to do for register, well, there's two things. We need to handle these errors because logging it to the console is awful. So let's change that. And the next thing that we need to do after that is actually validate these, because we aren't really doing that right now, as I'm about to show you. So let's just get rid of last name and first name here, and then change this to something valid. So j@c.com, and then for the password, we'll just say 123. Remember, we're supposed to have 8 characters here. So let's register this, and it registered, but it shouldn't be because we're validating, apparently. So we need to add validation and make sure that this actually works. So let's get to that. So for error handling, I'm going to create a new package. It's going to be called utils. And in there, we're going to have a file named errors.go. Here at the top, we just need to say package is utils. Now in their documentation, Iris specifies that we should use this package called go_playground/validator, and then version 10. So let's copy this and then paste it in our terminal and run it. So with that done, I'm just going to create a function here called createError. It's going to take in a status code, a title, detail, and Iris context. So let's add these imports here. And in the function, we're just going to say context.stopWithProblem, passing in our status code, iris.newProblem, and then we'll append onto that a title and detail. And for whatever reason, this appears to be a broken import, so I'm just going to change that. Now, a common error that we will run into is an internal server error, which has the status code of 500. And typically we'll just say internal server error for our title and detail. So I'm just gonna create that function here. That way we don't have to pass in this every time that we want to create an internal server error. Now underneath of that, we'll create a function to handle our validation errors. and we'll call it handle validation errors. It'll take in an error and context, and then we'll say if errors and OK, passing in error, and then validator.validation errors. So let's import that. And then within this, we will say validation errors is equal to wrap validation errors. So we need to create this function, and then we'll print to the console validation errors and just these validation errors. Then underneath of that, we'll say context.stop with problem, iris.status bad request, which is 400. And then we'll create a new problem, give it a title of validation error, a detail of one or more fields failed to be validated, and then a key, which is the errors, and this will just list what's wrong pretty much. So now let's add this import. And then underneath of this, we'll say create internal server error, and it's probably an internal JSON error, so let's not give more info here. Now for wrap validation errors, it's going to be returning this struct, which has a field of actual tag, namespace, kind, type, value, and param, and all those are strings. And here for wrap validation errors, let's create that function. It will take in our errors here, and it will return an array of validation errors. So here let's create a new variable called validation errors. It's going to be equal to the make function, and then for the first argument pass in a validation error array, then 0, and then the length of the errors. And then for each validation error and the errors passed in, we would like to create a new validation error and append it to this variable. So this is what that looks like. And then here at the end, we'd just like to return our validation errors. So let's save this. And with that created, let's go back to user.go. And here at the top where it says read JSON and we're getting this error, if it's not nil, we'll say utils.handle validation error. We'll pass in error and the context. And we just need to import utils here, so I'm just going to copy this, paste it, and change this to utils. Now here, if we're getting a user exists error, that means that something went wrong with our query here. So we're going to return a internal server error. So we'll say utils.create internal server error, passing in our context. And then here where we're saying if user exists equals true, then we will say utils.create error, iris.status conflict, which is 409. And then for the title, we'll say conflict, and then the description is that the email is already registered, and we'll pass in the context. Now, if we have a hash error here, we need to send out the internal server error, so do that. And this should now work. Well, we need to go back into main.go and add one line of code, and then it will start to work. So here in main.go, we just need to say app.validator. Validator is equal to validator.new. And the validation should now work. So now let's start up our server here. Say go, run main.go. And let's go back to Postman. And this should throw before it even gets to the email. So let's go ahead and register, quote unquote. And as you can see, these are the things that we're missing. So we need to have a first name field, which is a string. And we actually got an empty string here, so that's no good. And it's required. Same thing with last name, password needs to have 8 characters. So now we got a status of 400 and a title of validation error. So now let's try everything correct, just with a bad email. Now let's send that. And here we have that the email needs to be an email. So now let's go j@p.com, which is an already registered email. Send that. And we get this email already registered. So now let's say j@2p.com and send that. and it registered. So that's good. So now with register done, we would like to start to log in users, or be able to log in once we've created our account. So go back to user.go here, and let's create a function called login underneath our register function here. It's going to be taking in the same thing, an iris context. So the struct for the login user input is going to be a little bit different. It will just have email, which needs to be required in an email, and then password, which just needs to be required. And then we'll use the same type of logic here, creating a user input variable, and then reading the JSON from that user input. And if there's an error, we need to handle the validation errors, passing in the error in context, and then returning. And then beneath that, we'll create a new user variable called existing user, and then we'll create a error message variable which will say invalid email or password, so that we're consistent if the email is wrong or the password is wrong. So here we'll say user exists, and user exists error is equal to get and handle user exists, passing in existing user and the user input dot email. And if there's a user exists error, then we need to create an internal server error. Now, if user exists is equal to false, that either means that the user hasn't registered or they gave us a faulty or invalid email. So we need to create an error here, giving him the status of unauthorized, and we'll say credentials error for the title, and then just pass in this error message for the description, and then pass in the context. And then underneath of this, I am going to add something which says that if the existing user has a social login that's true, then we need to tell them that they have a social login that they use for their account. So I said that this is questionable as to whether you should let the user know that they logged in with OAuth, because typically the fewer things said, the better. So if you don't want to use this, you don't have to implement it. So if we get to this point, then that means that an email does exist. So a user does exist. So we need to compare what the user sent us for their password with what we have in our database. So we are going to be calling the compare and hash function from bcrypt, and we need to pass in the existing user password with the user input password, and we need to cast those both to byte arrays. Now if we have a password error, we need to send out the same message that we sent for an invalid email. So that is what we're going to do. And then if we get down to this point, that means that there's a user who gave us the right password, so we need to give them some credentials back. So we will send them a map of the ID, the first name, last name, and email. So now let's go back to main.go, copy this, paste it here. Let's change it to login, and then we'll say routes.login, and I added a comma there for no reason. Now let's restart our server here, and let's try our login out. So we'll go here, do the same thing. It's a post http :// port 4000 /API /login. For the body here, we'll go with raw JSON, and then we'll say email. Let's just give it a random email, z@z.com, and then password will be 1234567 8. Okay, not found. So what did we do wrong here? We've got localhost port 4000 /API /user /login, and let's send that. Okay, invalid email or password, so that's good. Now let's do j@p.com, And we know that this email exists, but this should give us the same result here. Invalid credentials. Very good. Let's go back here, j@2p.com. j@2p.com. And here we get the ID back, email back, first name and last name. Let's test out our validation here. Okay, there are errors coming. So j@2p.com. And our password needs to be required. So login and register are both working. And now we just need to go back to the React Native front end and start making requests to these endpoints. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So here I am on the front end of the app in the app file. And I'm going to go to constants actually so that we can add some endpoints to our endpoints object here. So in here, let's create a new variable called user. And it will just be equal to a string which has /user. And let's create a variable called user endpoint equal to server URL plus user. And in here we'll create a new property called register, which is equal to user endpoint plus register. And then same thing with login. Just need to change that to login here. And there we go. And actually, let's change these so that they don't include the word endpoint. So let's go back to location real quickly and our services. And here we'll just get rid of these where they say endpoint. So with these endpoints created, let's create a new service to call our server and log in and register. So we're going to call that user.ts in our services folder. And let's import Axios from Axios. Import endpoints from constants. And do we have our user yet? Let's go to our types here. Okay, we need to create our user type here in our types folder. So we'll say user.ts. So we need to export a type of user which has an ID of string, first name which is optional, last name which is optional, and email. And let's create an error type as well. So we'll say error.ts in our types folder, and we'll export a type called errorres, which has a status, which is a number, detail, which is a string, and title, which is a string. And we need to handle errors as well. So let's go to our utils here, and we'll create a file called handleerror.ts. We'll import Axios in errorres. And then we will export a function which takes in an error, which can be unknown. And then we'll say if the error is an Axios error, and if error.response exists, we need to return an alert, getting error.response.data, and then the detail from that object. Otherwise, we just like to return an alert of the error.message. Now let's go back to user.ts in services and import user and handle error. And then we'll create a type called datares here, which is just going to have a property of data, and that will be of the type user. Now let's create a new function called register user. It's going to take in first name, last name, email, and password, which are all strings, and it's going to be asynchronous. And within this, we need to create a try-catch block. In the try block, we are going to get the data, which is the type of datares, and we need to await a post request to our server, And the endpoint for that is going to be endpoints.register. And we're just going to pass in the email, password, first name, and last name as the body. And if data is present, then we need to return that data. Otherwise, we'll return null. And if we have an error, we need to call handle error and pass in that error. Now, beneath this register user function, let's create login user, which is going to be very similar. It'll only take in an email and password, but it's also going to be asynchronous. It'll have the try catch block as well. We're also going to make a request to our server just at the login endpoint, and we're going to await that, getting the data from it. And if data is present, then we need to return it. Otherwise, we'll return null. And if there's an error, we'll call handle error, passing in our error. So with that created, we can now create our user context. So we'll go back into your project directory. Let's close up some of these. And here I'm just in the root. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it context.ts. And in here, we need to import create context from React, import user from our user type that we just created. And then we need to export a const. I'm calling it auth context. And we're going to call create context. The type is going to be an object here. So let's create that. It's going to be user, which will either be user or null, and then set user, which will take in a user or null, and that's going to return void. Now within the create context, we need to pass in user, which is going to be null at first, and then this function, which is just going to be an empty function. Now let's navigate back to app.tsx, and let's import auth context and user. Also, let's import useState and useEffect from React. We're also going to need to install a package right now. So say expo install expo-secure-store. So with that installed, let's say import everything as secure store from expo-secure-store. Now within our app here, we'll create a new state called user, and it will either be user or null, and we'll initialize it to null. And then we'll use effect here, and it will have no dependencies. And inside of this, we'll create an asynchronous function called getUser. And then we will await secure store.getItemAsyncUser. And if user exists, then we'll set user to the present user. And we need to parse the JSON before doing that. And then here at the bottom, make sure to call getUser. Now what this pretty much does is every time the user opens the app, then we will be going to our secure store, getting our user, and setting the user. And with this user state, we can actually wrap our app in the auth context here, and then we can get this user variable in all of our components and screens. So we'll say auth context dot provider. And then let's move all this stuff into that. And then pass in value here, which is just going to be an object with user and set user. Okay. So with that done, let's create a new hook called useAuth. And we'll go to our hooks here, the hooks folder, and create this called useAuth.ts. And we're going to import use context from React, everything as secure store from expo secure store, and use query client from React query. Import auth context from context and user from our user types. Next, we're going to export a function called useAuth. And within this, we are going to get the user and set user from our auth context. So we're going to use the context here, passing in auth context. And then we are going to get the current query client with the use query client hook. Then create a function called login, and it will take in a user object. And then we need to stringify the user, so do that. And then set user to our passed in user. And store the stringified user in the secure store with set items async. And then call query client.refetch queries. Next, create a function called logout. Set user to null. And then say secure store.delete items async and get rid of the user item. And then call query client.clear. And down at the bottom, we can return the user, login, and logout in an object. So now we just need to implement calling the server on our different screens whenever we go to like the sign up screen and the register screen, and also the logout screen. We need to make the logout button functional as well. So let's go ahead and go to our sign in screen. And down at the bottom here, let's add some imports. The first import is going to be login user from our services. The next will be use auth from our hooks, and then the last will be use mutation, and that's actually put that way up here. So we need to get login from our use auth hook. So we'll say use auth. And then we need to create a new mutation so that whenever a user presses on the submit button, we pass that to the server, and then stuff happens and we'll get a response. And if that's a valid response, we will log the user in. So we'll say const native login is equal to use mutation. And then this needs to take in an asynchronous function. And the function will take in a parameter called values, which will be an object, and it will have a property of email and password. Now within this function, we need to await our login user function here, which will make a call to our server, and we'll just pass in the values.email and values.password into that function. And if the user exists, then we need to log in the user and then call go back. And underneath this, we'll say if native login is loading, we need to return some text which just says loading ... And we're going to change this to a lottery view later, so don't worry about that. We just need to implement the functionality first. Now here in the format component where it says on submit, let's just call native login .mutate, and we need to pass in values. And now let's test it out with j@2p.com, and I believe that was 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. And loading, and something happened. Oh, okay. I think I need to turn on my server real quickly. Alright, so the server is up and running. Now let's go and test it out. So j@2p.com, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. And now we are back in the account screen. So let's go to the account screen and change it, because we are currently signed in and it's still saying sign in. So we just need to change a few things. So we'll go to account screen here. So here we're setting user equal to false, and we can actually just get the user from our context. So let's do that instead, and it will start to work. So let's import use context, then import auth context, and get user from our use context here, and then just pass in auth context. And I just saved that. And now you can see at the top it says welcome, user's first name, user@example.com. So let's change that because that looks pretty ugly. And because the first name field is going to be optional, then we need to conditionally render text. So we'll say welcome, and if user.firstname is available, then we'll add a comma and space and then display the user.firstname. Otherwise, we'll just leave some empty text at the end. So we'll just say welcome. So welcome Jay, and then we'll always have the email. So here we'll say user.email, j@2p.com. And we can actually implement the signing out feature here. So let's do that by getting useAuth first. So let's import useAuth from our hooks. And then we'll say const logout is equal to useAuth. And down here where it says sign out, we can just call logout. And let's sign out real quickly. And here we are back at the sign-in screen, or rather the account screen, but it's rendering the sign in button and create account button. So let's sign in again and then go back to the other screens where it's displaying create account buttons and sign in buttons. So j@2p.com. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Sign in. All right, yeah, and then we'll just do the same thing that we did using that context for the saved screen. So just copy this over and go to the saved screen. And here where it says user is false, just paste that over, import use context from React, and import auth context from context. And that just got rid of that. Okay. And now all of our screens are working as intended. So now we'll sign out and then make the create account or signing up functional. So let's go to the sign up screen. And in this component, we will import register user and useAuth, as well as use mutation from React Query. And we're also going to need to import use navigation. So let's create our navigation variable. Next, let's get login from useAuth. And then we'll create our native register mutation. So use mutation. And then we'll pass in an asynchronous function here. And then down here where we have the onSubmit, let's just get this object and paste it into the parameter here. Paste it in as a parameter. And then we'll say const user is equal to await register user, passing in first name, last name, email, and password. And then if user is present, then we need to log in the user and then say navigation.goback. Now down here in onSubmit, let's call native register.mutate and pass in the values. Very good. And then let's also say if it's loading, then we'll just display some text which says loading. So if native register.is loading, return text which says loading. Alright, so now let's test this out. Let's say j at v.com, and we'll say ab 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and if we say 8, we're gonna get some validation errors here, so we'll just go with that. And now let's sign up, and we are now signed in. So let's sign out and then sign in with that account again. So j at v.com, ab 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and there we go. So the only thing that we need to change now is we need to get rid of this loading and replace it with a Lottie, because this is pretty ugly, doesn't look good. So let's go back to lottiefiles.com, go to discover here, and then free animations, and search for loading and pick out an animation that you like. If you want to change the colors, just edit the colors and download it, then add it to your assets here under Lotties. I named mine loading.json. So once you've got that done, go into your components folder and create a new component called loading.tsx, or a new file. For this, we are going to be importing style sheet, Lottie view from Lottie React Native, and useRef from React, as well as screen from our local components. So let's do the usual, export const loading, then we'll create our styles variable, and I'm going to create a ref here to start the animation manually because it wasn't working with me when I passed in true for the autoplay prop. So yeah, this is going to be the type of Lottie view or null, and I'm just going to pass in null. So one way you can do this is just by using useEffect, and then within that just saying animation.current.play and calling that. But I'm actually just going to call set timeout here and wait 100 milliseconds and do the same thing. And within this, we would like to return a screen which will have the style of container. The ref is going to be our animation ref here. The source is going to be your relative path to loading.json, or whatever you called your Lottie, and then we're going to give it a style of Lottie. And for the container, it's going to have a flex of 1, justify content to center, and align items to center. And for the Lottie, we're going to have a height of 250 and a width of 250. So now let's go back to our sign up screen and import Lottie, loading from our loading components, and then just return loading. Let's copy this, go back to our sign in screen and paste it here. Then import loading. Okay, let's get rid of that double return and import loading from our components, and let's test it out once more. So sign out, create account, j at a.com, ab 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and this. And there we got our loading Lottie, and let's just sign in again and make sure that that works as well. And then we'll say j at a.com, ab 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, and pass in that. And we also got the Lottie animation there. So that is it, guys. I hope that you found this video useful, and thank you for watching.